A dying town, a silent man drowning in grief, two children who had stopped eating, and then she walked off that train with nothing but a worn canvas bag and a letter no one ever got to read. Nobody knew her name, nobody knew where she came from, and the moment Eleanor Vale stepped onto that platform, every soul in Caldwell, Texas felt it, that cold, instinctive warning that something was about to change. They just didn't know if it would save them or destroy everything that was left. This story will take you somewhere real, somewhere it hurts before it heals. If you stay until the end, and I hope you do, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The heat that summer wasn't just heat. It was the kind that got inside things. Got inside the wood of old fences and made them split. Got inside the dirt roads and turned them to powder. Got inside men's heads and made them say things they couldn't take back. It was the kind of heat that had been sitting over Caldwell, Texas, for going on 11 weeks without a single break. And by the time July rolled around with its flat white sky and its merciless stillness, most people in town had stopped pretending things were going to get better on their own. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of town had gone from a decent moving stream to a sad, cloudy trickle you wouldn't water a dog from. Clem Hadley's cornfield, 40 acres that had fed his family and half the county for 20 years, was nothing but brown stalks snapping in a dry wind that carried dust instead of rain. Fletcher's cattle operation had lost 9 head in 2 weeks, not from disease, not from injury, just from heat and thirst and the slow giving up that animals do when the land stops providing. The feed store was running low. The bank was getting nervous, and the faces you saw walking the main street of Caldwell were the faces of people who had quietly, privately, already started calculating what they could afford to lose. There was a particular quality to that kind of waiting. It sat in the jaw. You could see it in the way men stood outside the hardware store with their arms crossed, not talking much, just watching the sky like it owed them something. You could see it in the way women moved through the market faster than usual, heads down, not making eye contact, because eye contact meant conversation, and conversation meant having to say out loud what everyone already knew. Things were bad, and they were likely to get worse before anyone showed them the decency of getting better. The train from San Antonio arrived at Caldwell Station at 6:47 in the evening, which was later than usual because the engineer had slowed down twice to check the rails in the heat. Rails had been buckling across the state all summer, and no one wanted to be the crew that put a train in the ditch. It pulled in with the usual noise and smoke, releasing a thin crowd of passengers onto the platform. A traveling merchant with 2 large trunks, a couple of ranch hands returning from a supply run to the city, old Dr. Beaumont coming back from his brother's funeral with a face that had aged 10 years in a week, and then her. She came out last, which people would later say felt deliberate, though it probably wasn't. She stepped off the train the way someone steps off a train they've been on too long, carefully, like the ground might not behave, and she stood on the platform for a moment and just looked at the town. She had a worn canvas bag over one shoulder, the kind that had been packed and repacked so many times the seams had developed their own opinion about what shape they wanted to hold. She wore a plain traveling dress that had once been dark blue and was now something closer to the color of an overcast sky. Her hair was brown and pulled back without much ceremony, a few strands loose around her face from the journey. She was somewhere in her early 30s, maybe younger, maybe older. She had one of those faces that didn't give itself away easily. What she didn't have was a husband waiting, didn't have family rushing forward to meet her, didn't have a name on the station master's list of expected arrivals. Bill Turnbull, who ran the station and prided himself on knowing the business of every arrival, watched her from behind his window and felt the particular discomfort of encountering something he couldn't immediately file away. "You know her?" he asked Earl Grady, who was loading freight nearby. Earl looked up, squinted, shook his head. "Never seen her." "She's not on the manifest." "Lots of people aren't on the manifest. Decent people are." Earl gave him a look and went back to his crates. The woman, Eleanor Vale, though no one on that platform knew her name yet, reached into the front pocket of her canvas bag and took out a folded envelope. She looked at it the way you look at something you've looked at so many times the paper has gone soft at the creases. Then she folded it back up, tucked it away, picked up her bag, and walked off the platform into Caldwell like she knew exactly where she was going, which, as far as anyone could tell, she did. She asked directions to Mercer Ranch from the woman who ran the dry goods store, a Mrs. Pauline Hawes, who was locking up for the evening when Eleanor approached her. Pauline Hawes was not an unkind woman, but she was a cautious one, and her caution had served her well in 43 years of watching Caldwell absorb strangers and spit most of them back out. She looked Eleanor over the way someone inspects a bolt of fabric, checking for flaws, running through possibilities. "You a relation of Silas Mercer?" Pauline asked. "No, ma'am." "Friend of the family?" "Not exactly." Pauline waited. Eleanor didn't add anything. "Mercer Ranch is a hard place to be right now," Pauline said finally. "Silas he's had a difficult year, lost his wife in March. The children are—" She paused, pressed her lips together. "You sure you want to go out there?" "I have reason to," Eleanor said. It wasn't an answer exactly, but there was something in the way she said it, quiet, not defensive, just certain, that made Pauline decide not to push further. She gave her the directions. "West out of town, past the split cottonwood at the crossroads, follow the fence line until you see the windmill." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "It's 3 miles," Pauline called after her. "Sun'll be down before you get there." Eleanor nodded without turning around and kept walking. Pauline Hawes stood outside her locked store for a long time after that, watching the woman get smaller against the wide, fading sky. Then she went inside, poured herself a cup of water, and thought about Silas Mercer's children, who she hadn't seen in town in almost a month. It was closer to 7:30 by the time Eleanor reached Mercer Ranch, and the light had gone that thick amber color it gets just before it gives up completely. The ranch wasn't hard to find. The windmill was exactly where Pauline said it would be, though one of its blades was cracked and turning slower than it should have been. The fence line she'd followed was in decent shape in some sections, falling apart in others. The kind of maintenance pattern that tells you a man is doing his best, but doesn't have enough hours in the day. The house itself was a solid structure, 2 stories, built to last. But it wore the particular expression of a place that had stopped being looked after from the inside. The curtains in the front windows were the same ones that had likely been there for years, faded now to something pale and without intention. The front steps had collected a thin layer of blown dust that no one had swept. A child's boot sat on the porch railing, left there and forgotten. Eleanor stood at the gate for a moment. From inside the house she could hear, or rather, she couldn't hear. No voices, no movement, no sounds of supper being made. Just a deep, held breath quiet that had its own specific weight to it. She opened the gate, walked up to the front door, and knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Then footsteps. Heavy, slow, the footsteps of someone who was in no particular hurry to find anything good on the other side of a door. The man who opened it was tall, raw-boned, with the kind of face that had once been younger looking than it had any right to be, and had recently made up for all that lost time at once. Silas Mercer was 38 years old, but was managing to look closer to 50 in the failing light. He had dark eyes that sat deep in a face that hadn't been shaved in several days, and he held the door the way you hold a door when you're prepared to close it again quickly. He looked at Eleanor, looked past her at the empty yard behind her, looked back at her. "Help you?" he said. Not rude exactly, just the voice of a man running low on everything, including words. "My name is Eleanor Vale," she said. "I believe you received a letter from my employer, Mr. Haddon, in San Antonio." Something shifted in Silas's face. Not warmth, it was too soon for warmth, but a slight lowering of whatever barrier he'd put up when he answered the door. "Haddon," he said. "Yes, sir." A long pause. He looked at her bag, at her face, at the fact that she was clearly alone and had clearly walked 3 miles in the heat. "Letter said you were coming," he said finally. "Said 2 weeks. I came early." "Why?" She didn't miss a beat. "Because you needed someone here sooner than 2 weeks." Silas Mercer stared at her for a long moment with an expression that walked the line between irritation and something else. Something that might have been, underneath all the layers of tired and guarded and grieving, a small, reluctant thing that looked almost like relief. He stepped back from the door. "Suppose you'd better come in then," he said. The inside of the house stopped her for just a second, though she didn't let it show on her face. It wasn't dirty, exactly. Silas Mercer was not a man who lived in filth. But there was a quality to the interior that she recognized. She'd seen it before, in other houses, at other times. The quality of a space where the person maintaining it has been doing so from sheer mechanical habit rather than any actual care. Things were in their approximate places. Dishes were washed and stacked. The floor had been swept, probably within the last few days. But the house had the feel of a stage set rather than a home. Things positioned to look like living was happening here, when in fact living had largely evacuated the premises. The table in the kitchen had 3 plates set, though the meal on them, what looked like beans from a can and 2 pieces of bread, had barely been touched. That was when she saw the children. They were at the table. 2 of them. The older one was a boy of about 9, with his father's dark eyes and a wariness in his posture that no 9-year-old should be carrying around. The younger was a girl, maybe 6, with her mother's coloring, if Eleanor had to guess, lighter, softer around the edges. And she was sitting with her chin almost on the table, looking at her food with the dull, unfocused expression of someone who has been told to eat so many times that the word has lost its meaning. Both children looked up when Eleanor came in. "Thomas," Silas said to the boy, "this is Miss Vale. She's going to be staying on for a while, helping out." He said it the way he probably said most things, flat, direct, not inviting argument. Thomas looked at Eleanor with the measuring look of a child who has recently learned that adults are not always reliable. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "San Antonio," Eleanor said. "You know anybody here?" "Not yet." "Then why'd you come?" "Thomas." Silas's voice had a warning in it, but Eleanor crouched down slightly so she wasn't looking at the boy from above, which was something she'd learned mattered. "Because somebody needed to," she said. "That's usually a good enough reason." Thomas thought about this. Apparently it passed whatever test he was running, because he looked back at his plate. Not eating, but no longer interrogating her. The little girl had been watching all of this with the plate still in front of her. Eleanor straightened up and looked at the beans and bread. She looked at the cold stove. She looked at the lamp on the counter that was turned low. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "do you mind if I look at your kitchen?" Silas, who had been standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, gave her a slightly baffled look. "You're in it." "May I use the stove?" "It's late." "I know." Another one of those pauses that Silas Mercer seemed to use the way other men used punctuation. Then he uncrossed his arms. "Suit yourself," he said, and walked out of the kitchen without explaining where he was going. Eleanor set her bag down and looked at what she had to work with. Well, the stove was a good stove, a cast iron range, older but solid, the kind built to last 40 years if you treated it halfway decent. It had just been sitting cold for a while. The flue needed to be adjusted, and there was an air pocket in the firebox that she had to coax out before the wood would catch properly. But once it did, the stove took the heat well. She found cornmeal in the pantry and a small tin of molasses pushed to the back of a shelf. She found a cast iron skillet that had been washed but not seasoned recently enough, which she fixed before she used it. She found a small sack of dried apples that were going a little leathery but were still good, and she sliced them thin and put them in a pan with a bit of the molasses and a piece of the lard she found in a crock. She worked efficiently and without making a production of it. The kitchen wasn't hers, and she was aware of that. She moved through it the way you move through someone else's space when you've been given permission but not invitation, carefully, noting where things were, putting them back where she found them. The cornbread took about 20 minutes in the pan on the stove once the heat was right. The apples with molasses she finished just before it. She didn't call the children, she just let the kitchen do its work. The smell was the thing, it was always the smell. There is something about warm cornbread, specifically the smell of it, that particular combination of corn and browning butter and heat and sweetness, that does something to the human body at a level below conscious thought. It goes straight past the thinking parts of the brain to the older, quieter parts. The parts that remember being small and hungry and having someone take care of it. Eleanor was setting the bread on the table when she heard small feet on the kitchen floor. The little girl had come in without being called or told. She stood in the doorway in her socks. She'd taken her shoes off at some point, which Eleanor hadn't noticed. And she was looking at the bread with an expression that was not quite belief yet, like she was afraid that if she moved too fast the smell would turn out to have been a trick. "You hungry?" Eleanor asked. The girl didn't say anything for a moment, then, "What's your name again?" "Eleanor." "That's a long name." "It is. Most people just call me Ellie." The girl thought about this. She came to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down, and Eleanor put a piece of cornbread on her plate. The girl looked at it, looked at the molasses. Can I have some of that? She pointed. That's what it's there for. Eleanor poured a small amount of the warm molasses over the cornbread. The girl picked up her fork, cut a small piece, put it in her mouth. Something happened to her face when she chewed it, something quiet and private. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but a beginning. The door of something opening, just a crack. She cut another piece. Thomas came in 2 minutes later, trying to look like he'd just happened to wander into the kitchen rather than been pulled in by the same invisible rope that had brought his sister. He sat down at his place and looked at the bread on the table with intense concentration, as if he was examining it for structural weaknesses. You can eat it, his sister told him, with the authority of someone who has already conducted the relevant tests. He ate it. Eleanor stood at the counter and ate her own piece of cornbread and didn't say anything and didn't make it into a moment. She just let them eat. She heard Silas's footsteps on the stairs before she heard him come into the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around, but she heard the quality of his silence change, shift from the flat, exhausted silence he'd been carrying since she arrived to something different, something that had weight to it. She turned around. I was looking at his children. Thomas, who was on his second piece of cornbread without seeming to notice he'd taken a second piece. His daughter, who had finished everything on her plate and was now looking at the apples with a cautious hopefulness. His jaw was tight. Eleanor turned back to the stove and gave him the privacy of it. After a while he came in and sat at the table, and she put a plate in front of him without asking, and he ate. Nobody said much. But the kitchen, which had been cold and quiet for a long time, was warm. And something that had been holding its breath in that house let out a long, slow exhale. Later, after the children were in bed, Thomas going with the exhausted surrender of a boy who had been running on vigilance too long, and the little girl, whose name Eleanor had learned was Clara, asking twice whether the apples would be there in the morning, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee and the practical realities of her situation. She hadn't told Silas everything. She hadn't told anyone everything. The letter in her coat pocket, the one she'd taken out and looked at on the platform, wasn't from Mr. Haddon. Haddon was real, a decent man in San Antonio who ran a placement agency for domestic workers and housekeepers, and he had indeed sent Silas a letter about Eleanor. But the reason she'd come early, the reason she'd pushed Haddon to move faster than his usual careful pace, that was her own business. She'd heard about Caldwell, about the drought, about Mercer Ranch and the water situation, about Gideon Rusk, whose name she knew from somewhere else, somewhere earlier. Somewhere she'd spent some time and left without much to show for it, except a collection of documents she kept in a flat envelope tucked inside the lining of her canvas bag. She wasn't going to do anything about that yet. She was going to do her job first: cook, clean, keep the children fed, hold this house together long enough for it to become a house again rather than just a structure people were surviving inside. That mattered. The other thing mattered too, but you couldn't build on sand, and right now this family was sand. She finished her coffee and rinsed the cup and set it on the drying rack. Silas was outside. She could see the ember of a cigarette through the kitchen window, moving slowly in the dark. He'd been out there for about 20 minutes. She didn't go out to tell him anything. He wasn't the kind of man who needed company forced on him, and she wasn't the kind of woman who thought she understood what was in somebody else's head just because she'd fed them. But she did move the lamp on the counter to a slightly different position, closer to the window, so it threw more light out into the yard. He'd been out there alone in the dark long enough. The next morning started the way mornings on working ranches start, early and uncompromising. Eleanor was up before 5, which she was accustomed to. She'd slept in the small room off the kitchen that had apparently been used for storage until Silas had, sometime in the last week, cleared enough of it out to fit a cot. It was not a comfortable room, but it was a room, and she'd slept in worse. She built the fire in the stove before she lit the lamp, which was an old habit from a time when she'd needed to be quiet. She had oats she'd found in the pantry, and dried fruit, and a few eggs from the half-dozen hens out back who were, she'd noticed the previous evening, being underfed. She made a proper pot of oatmeal with the fruit and a splash of the remaining molasses, and she scrambled the eggs with a little dried onion and some salt. The ranch hands. There were 3 of them. A man named Pete, who was maybe 50, and had worked for the Mercers for years, and 2 younger men, brothers, called Cal and Denny, came to the kitchen door at 6:15 looking like men who had been expecting to be fed bread and cold coffee. Pete looked at the pot on the stove and the eggs in the pan, and then looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite suspicious, but was not quite not suspicious either. "You the new cook?" he said. "I'm the new housekeeper, but yes." Housekeeper. He said it like he was checking the word for accuracy. "And cook, come in, sit down." He came in. Cal and Denny came in behind him, both of them younger, maybe early 20s, both of them with the kind of shaggy, sun-beaten look of men who spent most of their lives outdoors. They sat at the table with the unconscious hierarchy of the thing. Pete at one end, the brothers together on one side. Eleanor put food on the table and let them eat. "Where's Mr. Mercer?" she asked Pete. "Out at the east fence. Came down in the night. Something got through." He paused, a spoonful of oatmeal halfway to his mouth. "You know anything about fences?" "Not much." "Know anything about cattle?" "A little." "Know anything about drought management?" "Some." Pete ate the oatmeal, ate it with the focused attention of a man who is encountering something significantly better than he expected. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, "You planning to stay?" "That's my intention," Eleanor said. "Last woman Silas brought in to help lasted 11 days, Pete said. Left because, according to her, the house was too sad." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I didn't come here because I thought it was going to be cheerful." Pete looked at her for a long moment with the particular evaluating attention of a man who has worked with a lot of people over a lot of years and has developed very accurate instincts about which ones are going to be worth a damn. He went back to his oatmeal. "Good eggs," said Cal. "Thank you," said Eleanor. Silas came in at 7:30 covered in dust and with a scrape on his forearm from the fence wire. Eleanor was at the stove. She heard him at the door, heard him pull off his boots, heard the particular tired sound of someone sitting down because their body told them to. "There's food," she said without turning around. "Oatmeal's still warm. Eggs are gone, but I can make more." "Oatmeal's fine," he said. She put a bowl in front of him. He ate. She was refilling her own coffee when he said, without looking up, "Thank you for last night." She sat down across from him. "The children needed to eat." "I know they did." He said it slowly, without self-pity, but with the kind of flat honesty of someone who has run out of excuses. "I just haven't been able to." He stopped. "I know," she said. He looked up at that. Something wary in his face, like he wasn't sure what she meant, whether she was judging him. "I'm not criticizing," Eleanor said. "Grief does specific things to people. One of them is that it makes it hard to take care of ordinary life. The ordinary things feel pointless." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair description." "It's temporary," she said. Not as a promise. She wasn't the kind of person who made promises she couldn't keep, but as a statement of what she had observed. It gets less total over time. The ordinary things start to feel possible again. Silas looked at his oatmeal. "How do you know that?" She picked up her coffee cup. "Because I've seen it enough times to know it's how it works." She paused. "And because I've been through my own version of it." He didn't ask what version. She wouldn't have told him, not then. There was a time and an order to things. "The east fence," she said, steering them toward practical ground, which was where they both needed to be. "How bad?" He let her steer them. "About 20 feet down. Something got through in the night. Coyote maybe, or just the heat, wood drying out. Lost 2 calves before Pete found it this morning." His jaw tightened. "Can't afford to lose any more." "How many head do you have left?" He told her. The number was not good. She didn't say so because he obviously already knew. "The well water," she said carefully. "I was going to draw some this morning for the breakfast dishes. Pete said to check with you first about, is there a problem with the well?" Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite alarm. More like the look of a man who has been carrying a worry and wasn't expecting someone to notice it so directly. "The well's fine," he said. It wasn't entirely true. She could tell that from the way he said it, but she didn't push. There was a time and an order to things. "All right," she said. She stood up and took her cup to the sink. "I'm going to look at the window latches upstairs today. A couple of them aren't seating right. I noticed the draft last night." Silas had gone back to his oatmeal, but he paused at that. There was a brief stillness in him, the way there is when something lands closer than expected. "The one in the hall," he said. His voice had gone quieter. "The latch on the hall window. It's been—" He stopped, started again. "My wife used to mention it, said it let in a draft. I kept meaning to fix it." Eleanor looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. I'll fix it today, she said. He nodded once and kept eating. The days that followed had a pattern to them, which was what Eleanor was building toward. Pattern as a form of safety, routine as a substitute for whatever had held the household together before it fell apart. She was not trying to replace anyone or anything, she was building scaffolding. Temporary support, while the structure found its own strength again. She learned the ranch's rhythms quickly. Silas was up before the sun, which she matched. The hands ate at 6:15 and expected her to know their preferences by the end of the first week, which she did. Pete liked his coffee strong and his oatmeal plain. Cal would eat anything put in front of him without complaint. Denny was picky about onions, and she suspected he had a weak stomach he was too proud to mention. She cooked around these things without making them into a conversation. The children. Thomas needed to feel like he was contributing to things, so she found him tasks, gathering eggs, stacking wood beside the kitchen door, carrying water from the good side of the well. Not pretend tasks, real ones, with the implicit understanding that they mattered. He rose to this with a seriousness that would have been funny if it weren't so clearly something he'd been waiting for. Clara was different. Clara needed narrative. She needed things explained to her, needed to understand the story of what was happening around her. Eleanor talked to her while she cooked, which other adults apparently hadn't been doing, and Clara absorbed it like dry ground absorbs rain, fiercely and completely. "Why do you do it that way?" Clara asked one afternoon, watching Eleanor patch a tear in Thomas's shirt with small, tight stitches rather than the larger, faster ones Clara had seen before. "Because big stitches look fine until you put strain on them," Eleanor said. "Small stitches hold." Clara considered this with the philosophical seriousness she applied to most things. "Is that true about other stuff too?" "Usually." "Like what?" "Like houses," Eleanor said. "And like people." Clara thought about this for so long that Eleanor had moved on to a second shirt before she spoke again. "My mama used to sew," she said. "I expect she did." "She did big stitches." Eleanor kept her eyes on the work. "She probably had a lot of things to get done." "Yeah." Clara was quiet for another moment. "Do you think she would have minded, you being here?" Eleanor looked up at her then. Clara was watching her with an expression that was too old for her face. The expression of a child who has had to think about grown-up things before she was ready to. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that she would have wanted someone to look after you and your brother. I think that's what matters." Clara seemed to accept this, not because it was a complete answer, but because it was an honest one. Well, by the end of the second week, the rhythm had settled enough that Eleanor felt she could look at the wider situation. The well water was the thing that was nagging at her. She hadn't made a production of it. She'd simply been paying attention, the way she paid attention to most things, quietly, from the side, letting the picture assemble itself without forcing it. And the picture had some troubling elements. The water coming up from the Mercer well had developed a faint quality to it in the last several days. Not immediately obvious. You'd have to be looking, and you'd have to know what you were looking for. A slight discoloration. A smell that was almost metallic, almost not there, almost something else. She'd been boiling everything before the children drank it, which Pete had noticed and given her a look about that she'd answered with a look of her own that stopped him from asking questions. The creek water was worse. She'd drawn a bucket of it to compare, and the comparison was not reassuring. She had an idea where this was coming from, and it had to do with a name she'd heard before she ever arrived in Caldwell, Gideon Rusk. She didn't say the name out loud yet. She didn't know enough, didn't have enough that was solid enough to bring to someone. And there was no one in Caldwell she trusted enough yet to bring it to. She went through the envelope inside her canvas bag twice that week, reading through the documents she'd been carrying for months. Papers from a mining operation northeast of town, surveying records, water rights transfers that had been filed in odd ways in the county records. Things that individually meant nothing much, and collectively meant something very specific. She put the envelope back where it was and continued her work. The morning she noticed that one of the calves had been sick overnight, drinking water, belly trouble, the signs you'd expect if something was wrong with the water table. She made a decision. She waited until after dinner, when the children were in bed and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Silas was sitting on the front porch in his usual evening silence. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair without being invited, because they were past needing invitations for the small domestic things. Silas took the coffee without comment. They sat for a while. The evening was still too hot, the way all the evenings had been, but there was a slight stirring in the air that might have been a hint of something changing, or might have been just wishful thinking. "I want to ask you something," Eleanor said. "Go ahead." "The water situation, the well, and the creek." She paused. "Have you had anyone look at the water? Test it?" Silas was quiet for longer than the question required, which was, in its way, an answer. "It's the drought," he said finally. "Water table drops, quality changes. It happens." "That's true," Eleanor said. "It does happen. But that's not all that can cause it." He turned and looked at her. In the dim light from the window, she'd positioned the lamp again. His face was hard to read, but she could see that she'd touched something real. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" It was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed it, filed it away. "I'm saying that I think you should have someone test the water properly," she said, "before the livestock get sicker, before the children get sick." She let that land. "And I'm saying that if there's something else going on, beyond drought, you should know what it is." A long silence. The hot evening air moved around them. "What else could be going on?" he said. His voice was careful now. The voice of a man who already suspects he knows the answer and is not sure he wants to hear it confirmed. "I don't know for certain," Eleanor said. "Not yet." Silas looked out at the dark property, the fields he couldn't see, the cattle he'd hear if they were in trouble, the fence line that kept coming down. He rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand. "There's a man," he said. "Been buying up ranches in the county. Drought makes people desperate. Desperate people sell. He's bought 4 parcels in the last 2 months." He paused. "He's been after this land for a while. We have water rights that some of the others don't." "What's his name?" Another pause. Longer. Like saying it out loud made it more real. "Rusk," he said. "Gideon Rusk." Eleanor held her coffee cup with both hands and looked out at the same darkness Silas was looking at. "I've heard that name," she said. Silas turned toward her sharply. "Where?" "San Antonio. Before I came here." She wasn't going to tell him more than that tonight. Not yet. "Let's check the water first. Do that before anything else." He studied her profile for a moment in the low light, and she knew he wanted to ask more, and she knew he was deciding whether to push. She could almost feel him working through it. This woman who'd shown up on his doorstep, who'd fed his children and fixed his windows, and seemed to know things she hadn't explained yet. He decided not to push, for now. "All right," he said. "We checked the water." They sat a while longer after that, not talking, the darkness around them full of dry heat and the distant sound of something, a coyote maybe, somewhere in the fields, calling out to nothing and getting no answer. Inside the house, the lamp threw a square of warm light across the porch floor. Thomas and Clara slept in their beds upstairs, fed and safe for one more night, and Eleanor Vale sat in the dark with her coffee and the weight of what she knew, looking out at a ranch that was in more trouble than its owner understood, and tried to decide how much longer she could wait before she had to start doing something about it. The water test confirmed what Eleanor already suspected, though confirmation and suspicion are different animals. One sits quietly in your chest, the other kicks. Pete drove the sample into town on a Tuesday, wrapped in an old cloth, tucked into a tin can like it was something precious or something dangerous, which it turned out to be both. Dr. Beaumont, who was the closest thing Caldwell had to someone with scientific training, looked at it under his lens and came back with a face that said everything before his mouth opened. The water from the Mercer well had trace levels of sulfur compounds that had no business being in a well drawing from a natural aquifer. It wasn't enough to kill anyone outright. It was enough, over time, to make cattle sick, to make children prone to the kind of low-grade illness that looks like summer fatigue until it doesn't. Silas took the news standing at the kitchen counter, arms crossed, jaw working like he was chewing something that tasted bad. Eleanor stood across from him. Pete was at the table with his hat in his hands. "So it's not just the drought," Silas said. "No," Eleanor said. "Something's in the groundwater upstream." "That's what it looks like." Silas was quiet for a long time. Outside, through the kitchen window, Cal and Denny were working the fence line, their voices carrying in the still air without the actual words making it through, just the sound of men doing work that needed doing. Inside, the house ticked with the heat. "Rusk," Silas said finally. Not a question. "I don't know that for certain yet," Eleanor said carefully. Pete looked up from his hat. "I do," he said. Both of them looked at him. Pete was not a man who spoke without reason, which meant when he did speak you paid attention. He turned his hat once in his hands. There's an old mining claim about 4 miles northeast, up near Briar's Creek. Hasn't been worked in 2, 3 years. But somebody's been up there. I've seen wagon tracks on the cut-off road twice in the last month. Heavy wagon, the kind you use to haul equipment, or haul chemicals. The word sat in the kitchen like something dropped. You didn't say anything, Silas said. His voice had a tight edge to it. I didn't know what it meant, Pete said. Now I do. Silas pushed off the counter and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to both of them, looking at his land. The land that was drying up, the land where 2 calves had been sick last week, and one of them hadn't made it through. Eleanor watched him. She'd learned, in 3 weeks of living in this house, that Silas Mercer processed hard information the way certain storms do, quietly at first, gathering, then all at once. I need to go up there, he said. Not alone, Eleanor said. He turned. Eleanor. Not alone, she said again, in exactly the same tone. Not aggressive, just firm. If there are people using that site to put chemicals in the watershed, they're not going to be pleased to have someone show up asking about it. And if you go alone and something happens to you... She stopped. Didn't finish that sentence. Didn't need to. He looked at her for a moment with that expression he sometimes wore that she hadn't fully decoded yet. Something caught between resistance and the acknowledgement that she wasn't wrong. I'll go with Pete, he said. Good, Eleanor said. Pete stood up and put his hat on. When? Tomorrow morning, Silas said. Early, before anyone's moving on that road. Pete nodded and went out. Silas stayed at the window. Eleanor went back to the bread she'd been making before the conversation started, working the dough with her hands in the way that was more mechanical than attentive, the way you do a familiar task when your mind is somewhere else entirely. Eleanor. His voice behind her was quieter than it had been. Yes. You said in San Antonio you heard Rusk's name. A pause. What did you hear? She kept her hands on the dough. This was the moment she'd been deciding how to handle for 3 weeks. She'd thought about it while she made breakfast, while she repaired the window latches, while she sat with Clara and talked about small things and the hidden architecture of larger ones. I heard, she said slowly, that he had a pattern. Find land with something under it worth more than what's on top. Drought helps him. Desperate people sell cheap. And if the drought isn't quite desperate enough on its own... She stopped. He helps it along, Silas said. That's what I heard. The dough got a little more working than it needed. She made herself stop. How long have you known? Silas asked. I suspected before I came, she said. Knowing is different. I'm not sure I know yet. I have documents, things I collected before I left San Antonio. But documents are only useful if you can use them in front of people who matter. She turned around. Right now, the most useful thing is to find out what's at that mining site. He looked at her for a long time. She couldn't tell if he was angry that she'd come here partly for reasons beyond the job Haddon had sent her for. She waited to find out. You could have told me this when you arrived, he said. You weren't ready to hear it when I arrived, she said. You could barely feed your children. It was a blunt thing to say. She knew it when she said it. Silas Mercer's face went through something difficult, a flash of something sharp, then the working through of it, then the arrival at whatever was on the other side, which turned out to be not anger, but the particular defeated recognition of the truth. Fair enough, he said, and walked out of the kitchen. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and went back to the bread. The next morning, Silas and Pete rode out before 5. Eleanor was up when they left, as she always was, and she made sure they had food and water for the ride and kept her counsel about the worry that sat in her chest like a stone while they were gone. Thomas noticed something was different at breakfast. He was sharp that way, picked up on silences and set jaws and the particular quality of the air when adults were managing something. But he didn't ask directly. Instead, he ate his oatmeal and said with careful casualness, Pete going somewhere? Errand, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. She looked back at him. He went back to his oatmeal. Clara said, Are they going to look at the thing with the water? Thomas said, Clara. What? It's what they're doing. Eleanor looked at Clara. What makes you say that? Clara shrugged with the magnificent casualness of a 6-year-old who has absorbed more than anyone gave her credit for. Because you and Papa were talking about it, and because the water tastes funny. She took a drink of the boiled, filtered water Eleanor put in front of her every morning. This one doesn't. No, Eleanor said. This one's fine. How come? Because I boil it and run it through the filter. Can you teach me to do that? When you're older. How much older? Clara, Thomas said wearily. Clara subsided, but she kept her eyes on Eleanor with the focused attention of a child storing information. Eleanor found herself thinking, not for the first time, that Clara Mercer was going to be formidable in about 15 years, and whoever had to deal with that had her sympathy. Silas and Pete came back at noon. Eleanor saw them ride up from the kitchen window and went to the door. One look at Pete's face told her they'd found something. One look at Silas's face told her it was worse than either of them had said out loud. They came into the kitchen. Silas sat down heavily. Pete stood near the door like he needed to be close to an exit. Chemical drums, Silas said. 6 of them, maybe more covered under canvas. Old mining equipment, but the drums are new. Labels were taken off, but the residue... He rubbed the back of his neck. Pete knows what it is. Mining leachate, Pete said. I worked a copper operation in Arizona before I came here. That residue, the smell of it, someone's been deliberately introducing mining runoff into the watershed. It doesn't happen by accident. You have to route it. The kitchen was very quiet. There were tracks, Silas said. Wagon tracks and 2 sets of boot prints. One of the boots had a distinctive heel, worn down on the left side, unusual angle. He paused. I've seen that print before, outside the feed store. One of Rusk's men. Eleanor sat down at the table across from him. She folded her hands in front of her, which she did when she was thinking carefully about what to say and in what order. You can't go to the sheriff with just boot prints. I know that. And if you go to Rusk directly, he'll deny it, move the drums, and you'll have nothing. I know that, too. So what are you going to do? Silas looked at her. What are those documents you mentioned? She got up, went to her room, and came back with the flat envelope from inside her canvas bag. She laid the contents on the kitchen table carefully, the way you lay out something you've been carrying a long time and aren't sure anyone else will understand the weight of. There were 7 documents in total. Surveying records from the mining claim dated 3 years earlier, signed by a company registered in Austin, that Pete recognized the name of. A shell operation, he said. He'd heard the name in connection with a water rights dispute in the next county. A partial letter, unsigned, with language about accelerating site conditions near specific parcels. County filing records showing 3 water rights transfers in the preceding 18 months, all to holding companies that dissolved shortly after the transfers completed. And one document that Eleanor saved for last, a deposition record from a civil suit in Bexar County, an affidavit from a rancher named Gerald Sims, who had accused a land acquisition company of deliberately contaminating his well. The suit had been dismissed. Gerald Sims had sold his land 4 months later at a price 20% below its assessed value. The company Gerald Sims had sued was registered to a man whose name did not appear on any of Eleanor's other documents, but his attorney's name appeared on 2 of them. Silas read through everything slowly. Pete read over his shoulder. When they were done, Silas sat back and looked at Eleanor with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite trust, not quite the absence of trust, something in between that was trying to decide which side to fall on. Where did you get these? He said. From Gerald Sims, she said. I spent time in Bexar County last year. I heard about what happened to him. He gave me copies before he left. He said he didn't know what else to do with them, that keeping them hadn't done him any good, but he couldn't make himself throw them away. She paused. I kept them because I thought they might be useful someday. To who? Silas said. To whoever needed them. Something complicated moved through Silas's face. He looked back at the papers. He was quiet for long enough that Pete eventually moved away from the table and went to the window and stood there looking out at the yard, giving them the semblance of privacy. Why'd you really come here, Eleanor? Silas said. Not accusatory, just asking, in the tone of a man who was tired of not having the full picture. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I heard there was a family here that needed help, she said. Both things are true. The children needed someone, and Rusk needed to be stopped before he destroyed another ranch. I can't tell you those 2 things were equally weighted when I decided to come. I won't lie to you about that. He was looking at her directly now. But I can tell you, she said, that the longer I've been here, the first thing has gotten heavier, and the second thing has stayed exactly what it was. An obligation. She met his eyes. Not the reason I'm staying. The distinction mattered. She could see him taking it in, turning it over. Rusk is coming to the county auction in 3 weeks, Pete said from the window, still not turning around. He does every year. Shows up, looks at what's failing, makes offers. I know, Silas said. 3 weeks isn't much time. No, Eleanor said. It isn't. She began gathering the documents carefully, putting them back in the envelope in the order she'd established. The order that built the case most clearly, if you were following along. She was aware of Silas watching her hands as she did it. What do you need? He said. She looked up. I need to go to the creek, the upstream section near the mining claim. I need to take my own samples, and I need to see the routing myself. She paused. And I need you to start talking to the other ranchers. Not about Rusk yet. Just talking. Building the kind of goodwill that means when you do say something, people will hear it. Silas was quiet for a moment. The other ranchers think I'm the problem, he said. I've been refusing to sell my water rights. Some of them are angry about it. I know, Eleanor said. But I also know that 3 of them have wells that are starting to show the same quality issues yours is. And when a man's cattle start dying, he gets interested in cause and effect very quickly. She stood up. Talk to them, Silas. Not as someone with answers, just as someone who's paying attention. He looked at her for a moment with that half-decoded expression. Then something shifted in it slightly. Some small door opening, or some small thing being set down. You're going to that creek alone? He said. I was planning to, yes. No, he said. It came out flat and immediate, and she could tell he hadn't entirely planned it. He looked mildly surprised by himself. I'll go with you, he said. Day after tomorrow, when the hands can manage without us for a few hours. She nodded. All right. He got up from the table and took his hat from the peg by the door. He stopped with his hand on the door frame. Eleanor, he said, without turning around. Yes. The draft in the hall window. A pause. You fixed it the second day you were here. She waited. My wife said it let in cold air. His voice was even, controlled, in the way of a man keeping it that way on purpose. I told her I'd fix it a dozen times, and I never did. Another pause, shorter. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Eleanor looked at the table, at the grain in the old wood. Sometimes you just need to say things out loud, she said. Doesn't have to mean anything more than that. He stood in the door frame for another second, then he went out. Pete stayed a little longer. He turned from the window and looked at Eleanor with his measuring expression. He's a better man than he's been this year, Pete said. It wasn't a defense of Silas and wasn't a criticism, just a fact being offered. I know that, Eleanor said. Used to laugh more. He picked up his hat. Used to have a lot to say. Before. He'll get back to it, Eleanor said. She wasn't certain of that, the way you can't be certain of anything you haven't seen happen yet. But she'd been watching Silas Mercer for 3 weeks, and she'd seen the shape of the man he was underneath the grief. The way he listened when he thought no one was watching. The way he talked to the horses with a patience he didn't always manage with people. The way he'd sat beside her 2 nights ago without a word and handed her the lampshade she was trying to clean one-handed because she hadn't asked, but he'd noticed. She'd seen enough. Pete nodded once, the nod of a man whose opinion hasn't been argued out of him but has been given something to work with. He went out. Eleanor turned back to the kitchen. Clara was in the doorway. She'd come down the back stairs at some point, which was a habit Eleanor had learned to account for. Is Papa okay? Clara said. He's fine, Eleanor said. He looked sad. He was thinking about your mama. Clara considered this without the flinching a younger child might have. She had developed, in the 6 months since her mother died, the particular steadiness of a child who has been sad so long it had become part of her baseline rather than a departure from it. Does he do that a lot? I think so, Eleanor said. Do you? Clara said. Think about someone like that? It was the kind of question that could land in several places. Eleanor picked up a dish from the rack and dried it. Sometimes, she said. Clara seemed satisfied with that. She came into the kitchen and pulled out a chair and sat down with the ease of someone claiming their usual spot. Will you teach me the small stitches today? She said. You said when I was ready. I said when you were older. I'm older than I was yesterday. Eleanor looked at her. Clara looked back, completely serious. Eleanor set down the dish, went to the basket where she kept her mending things, and took out a scrap of cloth and a needle and a spool of thread. Come here then, she said, and the afternoon went on the way. Afternoons do in a house that is slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly learning to be a home again, with small things happening in the kitchen, with sunlight moving across the floor, with the sounds of work outside and the smell of something warm on the stove, and with a woman teaching a little girl how to make the kind of stitches that hold. The creek told the story plainly enough, if you knew how to read water. Eleanor crouched at the bank where Briar's Creek bent around the north edge of the Mercer property and held her sample jar under the surface. The water that filled it was not the clear brown of a healthy creek running through dry country. It had a faint milky quality, barely visible but there, and the smell that came off it was the one she'd been noticing in the well for weeks. Metallic, thin, almost nothing, which was exactly how it was designed. Contamination meant to be subtle. Contamination meant to work slowly, to look like drought and bad luck, and the kind of thing that happens when the land dries up and the water table drops, and there's nothing to do but sell and move on. Silas stood behind her on the bank with his arms crossed, watching her work. He hadn't said much since they'd ridden out from the ranch. He'd been like that the last few days, quieter than usual, which was saying something, carrying a specific kind of tension that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with anger that hadn't found its shape yet. "Same as the well," Eleanor said, holding the jar up to the light. "Yeah," he said. She capped the jar and stood up. The morning was already hot, the sky that particular flat white it got by mid-morning when there wasn't a cloud anywhere to offer the pretense of relief. About a half-mile upstream she could see where the creek bent again near the base of the rise where the mining claim sat. From this distance, nothing looked wrong. That was the point. "I want to go up closer," she said. "Eleanor, not to the site, just close enough to see the routing, where they're channeling the runoff into the creek bed." She looked at him. "I need to be able to describe it specifically, at the auction, in front of people." He looked at the rise, looked at her. "5 minutes," he said. "We go, we look, we leave." They tied the horses at the tree line and went on foot through the dry brush. The ground here was cracked and pale, the grass long dead, and their footsteps made a quiet crushing sound that seemed too loud in the still air. Eleanor kept her eyes moving, the brush, the rise, the creek bank to her left. She smelled the chemicals before she saw the evidence of them. That same sharp mineral smell, stronger here, coming on a faint breath of air from uphill. Then she saw what Pete had described. A shallow channel, clearly dug by hand, running from the base of the rise down to where it met the creek. It was narrow, not obvious from any distance, easily mistaken for a natural runoff gully if you weren't looking. But it wasn't natural. The angles were wrong, the edges too deliberate, and at the top of it she could see, just barely, the dark stain where liquid had been poured and had run down. She took out the small notebook she'd been carrying in her coat pocket and wrote 3 things in it. The angle of the channel, its approximate length, the distance from the creek bend. She drew a rough sketch. It took less than 2 minutes. "Okay," she said. They walked back to the horses. Neither of them said anything until they were mounted and moving away from the rise, and then Silas said, with a controlled flatness that told her exactly how controlled it was, "Someone built that channel. It didn't happen by accident." "No," Eleanor said, "it didn't. That's my land they're poisoning. My cattle. My—" He stopped. She heard him pull in a breath through his nose. "My kids are drinking that water." "They have been drinking the filtered water," Eleanor said, "since the first week I was here." He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the path ahead. "That's why you started boiling everything," he said. "Yes." A pause. "You didn't tell me. I didn't know enough yet to tell you something useful, and I wasn't going to scare your children." She glanced at him. "Or you. Not until I had something solid enough to do something with." He wrote in silence for a while. Then, "The auction is in 12 days." "I know. Rusk will be there." "I know that too." He was quiet again. When he spoke next, his voice had a different quality, something careful in it, like he was choosing the next thing very precisely. "What you're planning to do at that auction, it could go wrong in a lot of ways." "Yes," she said, "it could. Rusk has money and lawyers and men who work for him. If you stand up in front of the whole county and accuse him without enough—" "I know the risk," Eleanor said. "Do you?" He pulled his horse up slightly and looked at her. "Because if it doesn't work, if people don't believe it, or he talks his way out of it, you don't just lose the argument. He comes after whoever made the accusation. That's how he works. Gerald Sims didn't just lose his suit, he lost everything." Eleanor met his eyes. The sun was behind him and she had to squint slightly. "I know what happened to Gerald Sims," she said. "He gave me those documents in a rented room in San Antonio with his hands shaking. He'd been drinking. He told me he wished he'd gone louder instead of quieter, that going through the courts alone, without anyone watching, was what let Rusk bury it. She paused. The difference between Gerald Sims and what I'm planning is that I'm not doing it in a courtroom. I'm doing it in front of every rancher in this county, all at once, where Rusk can't manage the audience. Silas held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he clicked his horse forward. All right, he said. The 12 days between then and the auction were the most useful 12 days Eleanor had spent in Caldwell, and also the most uncomfortable, because useful and comfortable rarely travel together. Silas did what she'd asked. He started talking to the neighboring ranchers. Not about Rusk, just talking. Appearing at fence lines that bordered adjacent properties, helping with repairs on the Hadley place when Clem Hadley's back gave out and he couldn't work for 2 days. Riding over to the Fletcher operation with an extra length of rope and an hour of labor and nothing asked in return. He was not a naturally gregarious man, and this did not come easily to him, and Eleanor watched him come home from these visits with the particular exhausted look of someone who has been performing a version of themselves they're not used to. But he kept doing it. And slowly, the men who had been blaming him for the water rights situation softened slightly, the way people do when the person they've been angry at turns out to be less of an abstraction and more of a man with calloused hands and a tired face and a willingness to show up. Fletcher came to the Mercer kitchen 2 weeks after Eleanor arrived, the first neighbor to come voluntarily, and sat at the table and told Silas that 2 of his own wells had gone bad. The water had a smell. His cattle were off their feed. Silas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor put coffee in front of Fletcher and sat down. "Tell me about the smell," she said. Fletcher looked at her with the slight suspicion he applied to all women who spoke directly, then seemed to decide he didn't have the luxury of that right now. "Metallic," he said, "like old coins left in water." "When did it start?" 6-7 weeks ago. Thought it was the drought. Now I'm not so sure." "Have you had any contact from Gideon Rusk?" Eleanor said. Fletcher's expression changed, tightened. "He made an offer on my south parcel 2 months back. I told him no." A pause. "Offer's still open," he said. "Anytime I was ready." Silas said, "I think you need to hear something, John." They told him. Not everything, but enough. Fletcher was a practical man, not imaginative, not quick, but thorough. And he worked through what they were telling him with the patience of someone who needed to be sure before he moved. He asked several questions. Eleanor answered them. When they were done, he sat with his coffee for a long time without saying anything. "That's a serious accusation," he said finally. "It is," Eleanor said. "You're sure?" "Sure enough to say it in public." He looked at her. That's a brave thing or a stupid thing?" "Probably some of both," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but it was close. He stood up and put his hat on. "I'll talk to the Hadley boys," he said, "and the Pryor family, if they're willing to listen. They've been having water trouble too." He paused at the door. "The auction. Rusk always shows up at the auction." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's what I'm counting on." Fletcher left. Silas stayed at the table after he'd gone, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Clara's stitching practice was on the table in front of him. A piece of cloth with the small, careful stitches Eleanor had been teaching her. Slightly uneven, but getting better. He picked it up, looked at it, set it down. "It's working," he said. "Somewhat," Eleanor said. She had never been good at being optimistic before the thing was done. "We still don't have enough to guarantee anyone believes us over him. What do we need?" "One more thing." She'd been thinking about this since the creek. "The drums themselves. We need someone to see them who isn't you or Pete. Someone Rusk can't dismiss as having a personal stake. A neutral witness." She paused. "Dr. Beaumont." Silas considered. "Beaumont's not a fighting man. He doesn't need to be. He needs to be credible. A doctor saying he witnessed chemical drums at a mining site upstream from poisoned wells is harder to argue with than a rancher saying the same thing. Beaumont will want to know the risks first." "Then I'll tell him the risks first," Eleanor said. Honestly, Dr. Beaumont, it turned out, was a more complicated man than his exterior suggested. Eleanor went to see him the next morning, alone, and found him in his examination room reading a 3-week-old medical journal with the focused attention of a man who believed that knowledge, accumulated carefully over time, was the closest thing available to protection against the randomness of the world. He was 61, white-haired, and had been in Caldwell for 22 years, which meant he had delivered most of the county's children and sat with most of its dying, and had developed the particular moral fatigue of a man who had seen what people do to each other and chose, every day, to keep showing up anyway. He listened to Eleanor without interrupting. When she finished, he took his glasses off and set them on the journal. "The water sample you brought me," he said. "Yes, I told you it had sulfur compounds. I didn't tell you everything it had." He was quiet for a moment. There was a trace of something else. I wasn't certain enough to say it outright. But if what you're describing about that mining site is accurate— He stopped, put his glasses back on. "How long have the Mercer children been drinking that water?" "I've been filtering and boiling their water since the first week," Eleanor said. "Before that, I don't know, several weeks probably." "They're healthy?" "They're healthy." He nodded slowly. He was already convinced, she realized. He'd been convinced since he looked at that water sample and didn't say everything he knew. He just needed someone to come and ask him directly. "I'll go to the site," he said. "When?" "2 days before the auction. I want you to be able to say you saw it recently." "Fine." He picked up his journal again, then put it down. "Miss Vale, what happens if this man Rusk decides the problem isn't the auction, but you, specifically?" Eleanor had thought about this. "Then I'll deal with that when it happens," she said. "That's not much of a plan." "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked at her with the evaluating attention of a doctor looking for symptoms. "You're not afraid of him." "I didn't say that." "You're not acting afraid." "I'm very good at not acting afraid," she said. "It's a skill I've had to develop." He studied her for a moment longer, then seemed to decide that was enough information for now. "2 days before the auction," he said. "I'll be ready." The night before the auction, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table alone and laid out every document in her flat envelope and went through them in the order she'd used them. It was late, the children long in bed, Silas outside in his usual evening place, Pete and the hands in the bunkhouse. The lamp was turned up higher than she usually kept it. The documents were soft from handling, but intact. She'd done this kind of accounting before. Not exactly this, but the basic shape of it. The collecting of evidence, the building of a case, the decision about when to use it. She'd been doing various versions of it since she was 24 and had found herself in possession of information about a man who hurt people and believed he never would be stopped because people like him rarely were. She'd been wrong that time. She'd moved too fast, trusted the wrong people, and the man had walked away and she'd been the one who left town. She'd learned from that. She'd learned patience and order and the specific value of a public forum versus a private one. She hadn't won every time. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, not even to herself, not even at midnight with the documents spread out under the lamp and the auction 14 hours away. She heard the front door and Silas's footsteps in the hall, and then a pause, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table, at the documents, at her face. He came in and sat down across from her without being asked. He looked at the documents the way you look at something you're not going to understand better by looking harder, but can't stop trying. "You think it'll work?" he said. "I think it's the best chance we have," she said. "That's not the same thing." He nodded. He reached across the table and straightened one of the documents that was slightly crooked, a small, absent gesture. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that I—" He stopped, started again. "What you've done here, for this house, for Thomas and Clara." He stopped again. He was not a man who found this easy. "It matters. It matters to me. I wanted you to know that before tomorrow, in case tomorrow gets complicated." Eleanor looked at him across the table, at this man who had opened a door to her 3 weeks ago with the exhausted wariness of someone who had nothing left to protect and had slowly, stubbornly, begun to have things again, things worth protecting, things worth fighting for. "I know," she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the documents. "Tell me what I need to do tomorrow," he said, step by step. And she told him. The auction morning came gray and breathless, the sky for the first time in weeks carrying a low cloud cover that didn't promise rain, but at least had the decency not to beat down on everything from a clear blue height. People came into Caldwell from across the county. Wagons on the road before sunrise, horses tied along the main street 3 deep by 8 in the morning. This was what the county auction meant, not just business, but the one day in the year when every rancher and farmer and trader in the region was in the same place at the same time, which meant it was the one day when something said out loud was said to everyone at once. Gideon Rusk arrived at 9:15 in a black carriage that was slightly too fine for Caldwell, and which he had to know was slightly too fine, which meant he didn't care, which told you something about the kind of man he was. He was 50, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples, and the particular ease of a man who had spent enough years getting what he wanted that wanting things had stopped feeling like a risk. He had two men with him, large, quiet men who stood slightly behind him, and to either side, the universal posture of people paid to be in the way if necessary. Eleanor watched him from across the street. She had the canvas bag over her shoulder. The documents were inside it, in the flat envelope, and the 3 water sample jars were wrapped in cloth beside them. Dr. Beaumont was already in the crowd. She'd spotted him near the front of the gathered ranchers. Fletcher was there. The Hadley boys. The Pryor family. Silas stood at her left with Pete beside him, both of them looking straight ahead. "He's seen you," Pete said quietly. Eleanor had noticed. Rusk's eyes had moved across the crowd and landed on her with the brief, calibrating attention of someone who scanned rooms as a professional habit, the way a card player checks faces at a table. She didn't look away. The auction master called for attention. Business began. Land parcels were described, bids were taken, men raised their hands or didn't, and the ordinary machinery of commerce ground along the way it always did. Eleanor waited. When the auction master reached the 3rd item, a water rights transfer that she recognized from one of her documents, she stepped forward. "I need to speak to this county," she said. Her voice carried. She'd known it would. She'd positioned herself for it, at the edge of the crowd where sound moved best. The auction master looked at her with the irritated expression of a man whose process was being interrupted. "Ma'am, if you want to bid—" "I'm not here to bid," Eleanor said. She raised her voice enough for the back of the crowd. "My name is Eleanor Vale. I have been working at Mercer Ranch for 3 weeks. And I need every rancher in this county to look at something before another piece of land in this region changes hands." The crowd shifted. A specific quality of attention, the attention of people who have been waiting for something to break, settled over the street. Rusk had not moved, but his 2 men had straightened. Eleanor reached into her bag and took out the first water jar. The jar caught the light in a way that was almost too convenient, like the world had decided to cooperate for once. Eleanor held it up so the flat gray morning sky was behind it, and the faint milky discoloration in the water was visible to anyone close enough to see. The crowd had gone quiet in the particular way crowds go quiet when they sense that something real is happening rather than something performed. Even the horses at the hitching post seemed to settle. "This is water from Briar's Creek," Eleanor said, "drawn 4 days ago from the section that runs along the north boundary of Mercer Ranch. This," she reached into the bag and brought out the second jar, "is water from the Mercer well, drawn the same day." She held them side by side. "And this is water from Fletcher Ranch's east well, drawn this morning." John Fletcher, standing near the front of the crowd, didn't react visibly. He'd known she was going to use his water. He'd given it to her himself. "All 3 show the same contamination," Eleanor said. "Dr. Beaumont tested the first sample 3 weeks ago." She looked at Beaumont. "Doctor." Beaumont stepped forward with the reluctant certainty of a man who has made a decision he wishes he didn't have to make and is going to make it anyway. He was not a dramatic man. That was exactly why it worked. "Sulfur compounds and chemical leachate," he said. His voice was flat and professional and carried the specific authority of someone who was not interested in theater, only in accuracy. "Concentrations consistent with industrial mining runoff, not natural drought-related water table changes. I have seen this before in mining regions. It does not occur naturally." He paused. 3 days ago I visited the mining claim on the rise above Briar's Creek northeast of this township and observed drums of chemical material and a hand-dug channel routing runoff directly into the creek bed. The crowd moved. Not loudly. A shifting, a murmur, the sound of people recalculating. Rusk spoke from across the street. His voice was measured, almost bored, the voice of a man who had learned that appearing unmoved was its own form of power. "This is interesting storytelling," he said, "but I'd like to know what any of this has to do with me. I don't own any mining claim in this county." "No," Eleanor said, "you don't, directly." She reached into the bag and took out the envelope. "The claim is registered to a company called Harland Mineral Holdings, incorporated in Austin 18 months ago. That company's registered address is the same building as another company, Westgate Land Acquisitions, which has purchased 4 ranches in this county in the last 2 months. She held up the filing document so the men nearest her could see it. Westgate Land Acquisitions is represented by an attorney named Corbin Stahl, whose name appears on 2 separate land transfer documents also connected to water rights acquisitions in Begar County last year. She looked at Rusk. Mr. Stahl is currently sitting in that carriage behind you. Several heads turned. In the black carriage, a thin man in a dark coat had gone very still. Rusk's expression hadn't changed much, but something behind his eyes had sharpened, the way a man's eyes sharpen when he stopped being bored and started being alert. You're describing a chain of paperwork that could mean any number of things, he said. Shared legal representation is not a crime. No, Eleanor agreed. It isn't. She took out the partial letter, the one with the language about accelerating site conditions. But this letter, found at the mining site, discusses accelerating site conditions near specific parcels that are listed by their county filing numbers. She looked out at the crowd. Any rancher here who wants to check those filing numbers against their own property records is welcome to. The murmur in the crowd got louder. Clem Hadley pushed forward from the middle of the group. He was a big man, sun-damaged, with the kind of slow, deliberate movements that meant he was keeping something in check. My Southfield well went bad 6 weeks ago, he said loudly. I got told it was the drought. Same thing every other rancher in this county got told. He looked at Rusk. You made me an offer on that parcel a month after the well went bad. Which you were free to decline, Rusk said. I did decline, Hadley said. But Ed Pryor didn't, and now he's gone, and his land is sitting under your Westgate Company name, isn't it? That landed harder than anything Eleanor had said, because it wasn't her saying it. It was a man who'd lived in this county for 20 years, a man everyone in the crowd knew, a man who had no particular axe to grind except the one that had been planted in his back. Rusk's 2 men had moved slightly forward. Silas, who had been standing at Eleanor's left, stepped forward as well, and Pete stepped up beside him, and without any particular signal or arrangement, 3 of the neighboring ranchers did the same on the other side. It was not an aggressive movement exactly. It was more like the crowd finding its shape. Rusk looked at the shape the crowd had found and made a rapid and visible recalculation. He turned his attention back to Eleanor with the specific focus of someone who has decided to solve the immediate problem directly. Miss Vale, he said, and his voice had changed registers, quieter now, the kind of quiet that is not softness but its opposite. You came to this county 6 weeks ago with no family, no property, no stake in this land. You are a hired housekeeper presenting documents you claim to have collected from where exactly? What is your interest in this matter? It was a smart move. Eleanor had expected it. The question wasn't really about her credentials. It was about turning the crowd's attention from the evidence to the person presenting it. Because if he could make her the story, he could make the evidence secondary. My interest, Eleanor said, is that I have been living in a house where children were drinking contaminated water without knowing it, where cattle have died, and where a family that has already lost enough is being deliberately pushed toward losing everything else. She kept her voice even. You're right that I have no property in this county. That means I have nothing to gain by saying what I'm saying, which is more than can be said for the man asking the question. Hadley made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. Fletcher crossed his arms. Rusk said, I'll be speaking with my attorney about the defamatory nature of these accusations. Your attorney is in the carriage, Pete said from behind Silas. Deadpan. Several men near him laughed outright. The thin crack in the situation opened wider after that. It wasn't a flood. Nothing became simple or resolved in the street that morning, because things don't work that way in real life, and Eleanor knew it. But something shifted that was not going to shift back. The ranchers who had been individually carrying their suspicions and their water troubles and their reluctant offers from Westgate Land Acquisitions compared notes in the street for the next 2 hours, while the auction ground to a halt and the auction master gave up trying to restart it. Dr. Beaumont was surrounded by men asking him questions. He answered with the same flat professional precision he'd brought to his statement. Rusk did not leave immediately, which surprised Eleanor slightly, but stood at the edge of it all with his arms folded and his face controlled, watching, the way a man watches when he's planning his next move rather than accepting defeat. She didn't trust the controlled expression. It was too controlled. It meant something was still running underneath it. Silas appeared at her elbow as the crowd began to break apart in the early afternoon. He didn't say anything right away. He stood beside her and watched Rusk's carriage finally pull away down the main street. "That's not over," Silas said. "I know," she said. "He's not a man who loses in public and goes home and accepts it." "No," she said, "he's not. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." She looked at him. "I know that too." He looked back at her, and for a moment there was something between them that was not about Rusk or the water or the auction, something that had been building in the ordinary hours of the past weeks, in kitchens and porch evenings, and the small navigations of two people learning each other's patterns, and that neither of them had named yet, and were not going to name now in the middle of a dusty street with Pete standing 10 feet away. "Let's go home," Silas said. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and that night Eleanor could not sleep. She lay on the cot in the room off the kitchen and looked at the ceiling and did the thing she always did when she couldn't sleep. She ran through sequences. If Rusk did this, she would do that. If he moved this way, she would move that way. It was not a comforting exercise, but it was a practical one, and practicality had always been more available to her than comfort. What she kept coming back to was the expression on his face when he left. Not anger, not humiliation, strategy. She fell asleep somewhere past midnight and was jerked out of it at 3 a.m. by Pete's voice outside her window, very low and very urgent, saying, "Fire." She was on her feet before she was fully awake. The barn was in flames on the east side, and the wind, the first real wind in weeks, of course it was the first real wind in weeks, was pushing the fire northwest with an enthusiasm that felt personal. Orange light washed across the yard. The yard and the snow that had begun falling sometime after midnight, the season's first, was already complicating everything. Not deep enough to help fight the fire, just deep enough to make the ground treacherous underfoot. Eleanor hit the porch to find Silas already running toward the barn with Cal and Denny behind him. She could hear the horses inside, that specific terrible sound of horses that know they need to leave somewhere and can't. "Thomas and Clara," she said to Pete, who was right behind her. "In the house," he said. "I checked. Keep them in the house. Keep them in the kitchen, away from the east windows." She was already moving. "Wet cloths for their faces, in case the smoke comes this way." Pete didn't argue, which was one of the things she valued about Pete. He went back inside. She ran toward the barn. The east wall was fully involved, flames running up the dry wood with a speed that told her it hadn't started by accident. Fire doesn't take hold that uniformly, that fast, in multiple places at once, without help. Someone had set it at the base of at least 2 walls. She registered this with the part of her brain that kept cataloging information regardless of circumstances, and then she filed it and focused on what was in front of her. Silas had already gone inside. She could see him through the smoke, at the far end where the stall horses were tied. 4 horses, all of them pulling back and screaming in the particular high register of horses in genuine terror. Cal had gotten one loose and was fighting the animal toward the doors. Denny was at the second stall, but the horse had kicked the gate shut and he couldn't get it open. Eleanor went to him. She'd grown up around horses, which was not something she'd mentioned to anyone on the ranch because it hadn't come up, and she didn't volunteer information about herself as a general habit. She put herself between Denny and the gate, took the sliding bolt, hot, even through her sleeve, and hit it upward rather than across, the way these old gates opened when they were warped, which they always were. The gate swung. The horse surged forward, and she stepped hard into the wall to let it pass, and felt the animal's shoulder catch her and spin her against the wood. She didn't go down. She grabbed the wall and pushed herself upright and kept moving. Silas had 2 horses loose at the far end, but a burning beam had come down between him and the doors, and the smoke was thick enough now that she was navigating by sound, and the orange glow from above more than sight. She could hear him, coughing, the horses crashing against the sides of the stall, and she found the beam and the clear path around it and called his name. "Here," he said, from somewhere in the smoke. "Follow my voice." He came toward her with a horse on each side, and the 3 of them, 2 people and 2 animals moving on pure adrenaline and the basic mammalian preference for not being on fire, made it out the main doors into the snow-whipped yard 10 seconds before the roof section above the last stalls collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning wood. They came out into the cold and the dark, and the swirling snow, and both of them went to their knees simultaneously, not from injury exactly, but from the simple physical event of having been pushing very hard and then stopping. The horses pulled free and ran, and Cal and Denny chased them toward the paddock. Eleanor stayed on her knees for a moment. Silas was beside her. She could feel the heat on her face from the barn, which was fully gone now, and the snow falling into it was making the kind of noise snow makes when it falls into fire, a constant quiet hiss that seemed too small for the scale of the event. She made herself stand up, took inventory, singed sleeve, bruised shoulder from the horse, smoke in her lungs that was going to hurt worse tomorrow than it did now. Nothing serious. She looked at Silas. He had a cut on his forehead from somewhere. She hadn't seen it happen. And his right arm was held slightly away from his body in the specific unconscious way of someone managing pain they haven't assessed yet. "Your arm," she said. "I'm fine." "Silas." "Beam caught it on the way out," he said. "It's fine." "Let me see it." He let her see it. She pushed his sleeve up and looked at it in the firelight. A burn, not deep, but not nothing, running from his wrist to just below his elbow. She pulled the sleeve back down because cold and cloth were better than air on a fresh burn. "Inside," she said. "The horses, Cal and Denny have the horses, inside." He went. Not without resistance. She could feel him wanting to stay, wanting to do something about the barn that was now a complete loss regardless of what anyone did. But he went. The storm hit them fully about an hour later, which felt like an additional cruelty that Eleanor decided not to take personally. The snow that had been tentative and preliminary became something serious and committed, and by 5 in the morning the roads out of the ranch were impassable, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of number that has opinions about who survives the night. The ranch was cut off. Eleanor had known winters. She'd lived through the hard ones, the ones that make decisions for you about what matters and what doesn't. She'd been in isolated places before and had learned the particular discipline of managing a closed system. Limited resources, limited options, no one coming, without letting that limitation become panic, because panic wastes heat. The house held 6 people: herself, Silas, Thomas, Clara, and the 2 brothers, Cal and Denny, who she'd pulled inside when it was clear the bunkhouse wasn't going to be safe to heat alone with their wood supply. Pete had taken the last viable horse and ridden for the Fletcher property before the roads closed completely, which had been his own decision and the right one. Fletcher had more men and more resources, and Pete could coordinate help from there when the storm broke. Silas's arm needed cleaning and wrapping, which Eleanor did at the kitchen table while Thomas watched with the focused attention of a boy filing away information he intended to use later. The burn was going to scar. She told Silas this without softening it, because he was not a man who benefited from being softened at. "I know," he said. "You're not going to be using that arm properly for a week. I know that too. Which means you're going to have to let other people do things." He looked at her with an expression that was pain and stubbornness in roughly equal parts. "I'm aware of what it means." "Just establishing expectations," she said, and put the bandage on with enough firmness to make her point. The storm lasted 3 days. Eleanor had dealt with harder physical circumstances, but she had not often dealt with harder emotional ones, because a house cut off from the world in winter is a small container and everything inside it: fear, pain, exhaustion, the specific weight of what had just been lost and what might still be at stake, concentrates quickly. Clara handled it by attaching herself to Eleanor with the steadfastness of a child who has identified the most reliable fixed point in an uncertain environment. She slept in Eleanor's cot the first night, pressed against her back without asking, and Eleanor let her. Thomas handled it by taking inventory, counting the food, counting the wood, asking Silas practical questions about the barn and the livestock, with the serious precision of a boy who needed problems to have concrete solutions. Silas handled it the way he handled most things, by being useful in whatever way his one good arm allowed, and by sleeping less than anyone else, and by sitting at the window at night watching the snow with an expression Eleanor recognized now. The second night of the storm, she found him there at midnight. She'd gotten up to check the stove. It needed feeding every few hours, or the kitchen would go cold, and found him at the window with a blanket around his shoulders, not asleep, watching the white nothing outside. She put wood in the stove and put a pot of water on because there was nothing useful about sitting in a cold house at midnight without at least having something warm to drink. Then she pulled a chair up next to his and sat down. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Outside, the storm moved over the house with the impartial thoroughness of a force that doesn't know what it's burying. After a while, Silas said, "The barn took 11 years to build properly. I mean, I built the original structure when I was 26. But it took 11 years to get all the equipment right, all the stalls the way I wanted them. He paused. Martha always said I paid more attention to that barn than to the house. Eleanor said nothing. She was right, he said. She usually was. He looked at the snow. I keep thinking I should be angrier about it. The barn. What Rusk did. His voice was quiet. Not sad exactly. More like someone working something out. But what I actually feel is tired. Just very tired of losing things. Eleanor looked at the side of his face in the low light. That's not weakness, she said. It feels like it. It isn't. It's what happens when someone has been hit enough times that their body stops generating rage as a defense mechanism and starts just trying to recover. She paused. The anger will come back. It usually does, but right now tired is appropriate. He turned and looked at her. You talk about this like you know it from the inside. I do, she said. What happened to you? She thought about this version of her life that had led her to a kitchen in Caldwell, Texas in the middle of a snowstorm. The part she'd told no one. The year in Bexar County. The marriage that had lasted 2 years and ended badly enough that she'd spent a year afterward being very careful and very quiet and very much alone. The slow rebuilding of a version of herself that could move through the world without flinching at the wrong moments. A lot of things, she said, over time. You don't want to say. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I want to drink this and make sure the house stays warm. He looked at her for a moment longer, with an expression she'd been watching change for 6 weeks. This man who had started out as a closed door and was now something else, something that was still careful and still quiet, but was no longer just keeping itself intact. He was leaning towards something. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing before it changes. Eleanor, he said. Don't, she said softly. He stopped. Not tonight, she said. Not in the middle of this. When the storm clears and things are... She stopped herself from saying better because nothing was going to be simply better. When things are clearer, then. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded just once and looked back at the snow. They sat there for another hour, drinking the weak tea she made from the last of the dried herbs in the pantry, not talking much, listening to the storm work its way across the property. At some point his shoulder was against hers, and neither of them moved away from it. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, it broke completely. The way Texas storms sometimes do, as if they've made their point and have other places to be. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp it almost hurt, and the snow line across the land was brilliantly, indifferently white, covering the ruin of the barn and the rutted fields and the dead fence sections with equal impartiality. Cal spotted the riders first. Coming from the Fletcher place, he said from the window. And they've got more people with them. Eleanor looked. He was right. 3 riders from the Fletcher direction, and behind them more, 8, 10, 12 people on horseback and in wagons, picking their way through the snow on the road that was just barely passable now. Silas stood at the window beside her. His arm was still in the sling she'd made. His face was still marked with the cut from the barn, which she'd stitched herself on the first night. He looked like a man who had been through something and had not entirely come out the other side yet. The riders were Caldwell people, ranchers and their hands, and a few of the townsmen who had stood in that crowd at the auction. They came with tools and lumber strapped to the wagons and food in covered containers and the particular purposefulness of people who have decided to do something instead of talking about what needs doing. Fletcher was at the front. He rode up to the gate and looked at Silas, and then he looked at the burned foundation where the barn had been, and his jaw went tight. We heard, he said. Pete got to us the morning of the storm. I'm all right, Silas said. The children are all right. Fletcher looked at Eleanor. He had the expression of a man who has revised his opinion about something and is too practical to be embarrassed about having needed to revise it. Miss Vale, he said. He said her name with a respect that hadn't been there at their kitchen table meeting. Mr. Fletcher, she said. Thank you for coming. Brought Hadley and his boys, Fletcher said. Pryor's son, too, and some of the men from town. We figured... He looked at the site of the barn again. Looked at Silas. Nobody burns a man's barn in a snowstorm and deserves to get away with it. There was a moment, standing in the cold white light of that broken storm morning, when Eleanor felt something she was cautious about feeling prematurely. Not victory. She was too experienced to call it victory yet, because Rusk was still out there, and whatever legal and practical fallout was coming hadn't arrived yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that felt like weight being redistributed, like a single person carrying something alone, finally having other hands reach up and take part of it. Silas turned to her. He said quietly, just for her, "You did this." "We did this," she said. "You talked to those people. You showed up at their properties. You, Eleanor." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for a while now, with a weight to it that was specific to her and no one else. "Accept the thing." She looked at him, looked at the people coming through the gate with lumber and food, and the particular dignity of neighbors choosing to behave like neighbors. "All right," she said. She accepted the thing. The barn foundation was still smoking in places when the men started laying new timber. There is something particular about watching people work on something they didn't have to show up for. It has a different quality than paid labor, slower in some ways, less efficient, more talking, more standing around with coffee making collective decisions about the right way to do a thing. But it has a solidity to it that hired work doesn't always carry. The Hadley boys argued about the framing for 20 minutes before Clem Hadley Sr. told them both to shut up and do it his way, and Eleanor watched this from the kitchen window and felt something unclenching in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched. Fletcher had brought his wife, which surprised Eleanor. Margaret Fletcher was a compact, gray-haired woman who came into the Mercer kitchen with a covered pot and a cake tin and surveyed the space with the eyes of a woman who understood kitchens as infrastructure. She set her things down and looked at Eleanor and said, "I heard what you did at the auction." "What did you hear?" Eleanor said carefully. "That you stood in the middle of the street and said the thing that needed to be said." Margaret put the lid back on her pot. "My husband's been suspicious of Rusk for a year. Couldn't prove anything. Couldn't get anyone to listen. Kept saying he was being paranoid." She paused. "He wasn't paranoid." "No," Eleanor said. "He wasn't." "How'd you know to come here? To Caldwell, specifically?" Eleanor thought about the honest answer. "I followed a name," she said, "and I needed work." Margaret looked at her for a moment with the straightforward assessment of a woman who had spent 40 years reading people. "You staying?" Eleanor looked out the window at the men working on the barn frame, at Pete directing Cal toward a timber that needed moving, at Silas with his one good arm doing what he could and being carefully not managed by everyone around him, which was its own form of respect. "Yes," she said. The first time she'd said it without the qualification of intention. Not "I plan to" or "I intend to," just "yes." Margaret nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. "Good," she said, and went about setting up to feed 12 people, and Eleanor went about helping her, and together they worked in the kitchen of a house that was slowly, imperfectly, becoming a home again. The legal machinery began moving about a week after the storm broke. It moved slowly at first, which was what Eleanor had expected. The county sheriff, a man named Aldous Webb, who had 20 years of carefully maintained neutrality behind him and no particular desire to start a fight with a wealthy land buyer, came out to the ranch with the expression of a man who would very much prefer this problem not exist. He looked at the documents. He looked at the water samples Dr. Beaumont had preserved. He looked at Silas's burned arm and the foundation of the barn and the channel that Pete took him to see at the mining site, which was still there because whoever had built it had either been too confident or too hurried to cover their tracks properly. He went back to town, and Eleanor could not tell from his face what he was going to do with any of it. She found out 3 days later when 2 state investigators arrived from Austin. They weren't loud about it. They came quietly, by arrangement, and they brought their own documents, which, it turned out, overlapped with Eleanor's in ways that told a larger story than either set told alone. Gideon Rusk had been of interest to the state land office for some time, it emerged. Not because anyone had caught him yet, but because the pattern of failing ranches and timely acquisitions and dissolved holding companies had attracted attention from people whose job was to notice patterns. Eleanor's documents, specifically the connection between Harlan Mineral Holdings and Westgate Land Acquisitions through the attorney Corbin Stahl, gave them the link they'd been missing. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with the 2 investigators for 3 hours and answered their questions with the thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for this conversation, in some sense, for over a year. She told them about Gerald Sims. She told them about the deposition that had been suppressed. She told them about the specific sequence of water contamination and acquisition offers that she had documented across 3 counties. The older investigator, a man named Marsh, who had said very little for most of the 3 hours, looked at her near the end and said, "You put this together on your own?" "I had help," Eleanor said. "Pete Alderman found the drums. Dr. Beaumont provided medical testimony. The ranchers here provided corroboration. She paused. And Silas Mercer refused to sell his land when every pressure in the world was telling him to. That mattered. Marsh wrote something in his notebook. You plan to testify if this goes to formal proceedings? Yes, she said. It could take months. Could be contentious. I know what contentious looks like, Eleanor said. He looked at her over his glasses with an expression that was professionally neutral but had something behind it. Respect, maybe, or at least the recognition of someone who had done what most people don't do, which is stay with a hard thing until the hard thing was finished. All right, he said. Rusk was not arrested that week, or the week after. That was the part Eleanor had to explain to Silas, who was not a patient man when it came to things he had a right to be impatient about. Justice, she told him, moves at the speed of paperwork, which is its own kind of cruelty, but is also the thing that makes it stick. Rusk couldn't disappear quietly now. Too many people knew too much. There were state investigators involved, and the kind of attention he'd been successfully avoiding for years had found him. He was not going to be burning any more barns. How do you know that? Silas asked. They were on the porch in the evening. It was colder now, properly cold, winter settling in for real. Eleanor had her coat on. Silas was in his shirt because the cold did not seem to negotiate with him the way it did with most people. Because what he was doing only worked in the dark, she said. Rusk is a man who depends on people not comparing notes, not talking to each other, not having anyone help them put the pieces together. The public accusation at the auction, the one you let me make, she looked at him, that ended his ability to operate in darkness. Whatever he does next, people will be watching him. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, you said the one you let me make, like I had a choice about stopping you. You did have a choice. I don't think I did, he said. I think once you had your mind set, a freight train couldn't have stopped you. She almost smiled. I would have done it with or without your support. You know that. I know it. He paused. I also know it would have been a lot harder, and a lot lonelier. He said the last word in a different register, slightly quieter, the way you say a word when you mean more than the word. Eleanor looked at the cold, dark yard. The new barn frame was up, rough still, needing weeks more work, but standing. The horses were in the temporary shelter the men had rigged. The field beyond was dormant but not dead, waiting under the cold for something she'd been told was going to come eventually. Silas, she said. Yeah, I need to tell you something about why I came here. She'd been building up to this for weeks, finding the right moment, which she'd finally accepted was not going to arrive on its own. The full version, not the Haddon version. He turned and looked at her. The lamp she'd positioned in the window was behind her, and she knew she was mostly in shadow from where he was sitting. All right, he said. She told him about the year before Caldwell, about a man she'd married at 26 who had turned out to be the kind of man you don't recognize clearly until you're inside the situation, and then you recognize him very well. About leaving that marriage with the two things she had left when she left it, a canvas bag and the habit of paying very close attention to what was happening around her, because paying close attention had been a survival skill for a long time before it became anything else. About Bexar County and Gerald Sims and the documents and the slow accumulation of a purpose that had given shape to the years since. She didn't perform any of it. She told it the way she told most things, plainly, in order, without editorializing except where she actually had an opinion. Silas listened without interrupting, which she appreciated more than she would have said. When she was done, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable so much as full, the kind of silence that has a lot in it. The man, Silas said. Your husband. Ex-husband. Where is he now? San Antonio. Remarried. A pause. He's not the point. He's just part of how I became someone who ended up here. Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. He had a particular quality when he was sitting with something difficult, a stillness that was not absence but presence, the kind of quiet that means someone is actually thinking rather than just not speaking. That took courage, he said finally, telling me that. Not particularly, she said. I've been carrying it a while. It gets lighter when you put it down. Still, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there it was again. That thing that had been accumulating between them in kitchens and porch evenings, and 3 days of snowstorm, and the particular intimacy of two people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side. It had been accumulating for long enough that it had weight now, actual gravitational weight, and pretending not to feel it would have required more effort than either of them had left for pretending. "The storm's been over for 2 weeks," she said. He understood what she meant. She'd told him in the storm, not tonight, when things are clearer. He looked at her with the steady attention of a man who was not going to rush it, but was also not going to retreat from it. "I'm a difficult man," he said. "I know that. I don't talk enough. And when I do talk, I say things badly about half the time. I don't have—" He stopped, seemed to reorganize. "This ranch is a hard place. It's better than it was 2 months ago, but it's still a hard place. And I have 2 children who are going to complicate every simple thing." "I know all of that," Eleanor said. "I'm not saying it to warn you off. I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't want you to be here because of obligation," he said. "The job, Haddon, whatever brought you here first. I want you to be here because you want to be here." It was the most direct thing he'd said to her, possibly the most direct thing she'd heard him say to anyone, and it had cost him something to say it. She could see that. "I am here because I want to be here," she said. "That has been true for at least a month, maybe longer." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at the yard for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. It was not a romantic declaration. It was not flowers and speeches and the kind of moment that looks a certain way in stories. It was 2 people who had both been damaged by their lives in different ways, sitting on a cold porch in the dark, agreeing on something true, which was, Eleanor thought, probably more solid than most of the other kinds. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be, and would have been suspicious if they were. 2 people deciding to be something to each other does not automatically solve the practical problem of what that looks like day to day, and the practical problem had complications. Thomas, for one. Thomas had been watching Eleanor with his father for weeks, with an intelligence that was sometimes uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. He was 9 years old and had spent the last 7 months learning, through hard experience, that stability was not guaranteed and that adults were not always reliable, and that the things you depended on could be gone before you got the chance to understand they were leaving. He was not going to simply accept a new arrangement in his household without putting it through whatever internal testing process he'd developed. The test, when it came, was delivered in the kitchen on a Thursday morning about 3 weeks after the storm. Eleanor was making biscuits. Thomas sat at the table doing his letters. Eleanor had been working with both children on their schooling, which had lapsed badly in the preceding months, with the focused attention that meant he was not really doing his letters. "Are you going to marry my father?" he said. Eleanor kept her hands in the dough. "That's a direct question. I'm a direct person." She looked at him. He met her gaze with his father's dark eyes and his own version of his father's stillness. He was not being hostile. He was being precise, which was different. "I don't know the answer to that question right now," she said honestly. "Your father and I haven't discussed it. But you're more than—" He struggled with the vocabulary of it, which was fair since the vocabulary for what adults are to each other in complicated domestic situations is genuinely limited. "You're not just the housekeeper anymore." "No," she said. "I'm not." He thought about this. "Do you want to stay?" "Yes." "Forever?" She met his eyes. "I can't promise you forever, Thomas. Nobody can promise forever. But I can tell you that I'm not planning to leave. And I can tell you that when things get hard—" She thought about how to say it in a way that was honest rather than reassuring. "I don't leave when things get hard. That's not my nature." He processed this with the seriousness it deserved. He was quiet for long enough that she'd gone back to the biscuits before he spoke again. "Pete says you went into the barn fire," he said. "Pete was in the house with you. He saw you go in before he came inside. He told Dad." Eleanor said nothing. "That was stupid," Thomas said. "Yes," she said, "somewhat. But you got the horses out." "Cal and your father got most of the horses out." "But you helped." "Yes." Another silence. She heard his pencil moving on the paper. Actually moving this time. Actually doing letters. "Okay," he said. The simplicity of it almost undid her. She kept her hands in the dough and did not let it show on her face. Clara required no testing. Clara had decided about Eleanor sometime around the 3rd day and had simply been waiting, with the serene patience of a 6-year-old who has made up her mind and is allowing the adults to catch up to her conclusion. When Silas sat beside Eleanor at the table one evening instead of across from her, Clara looked at this for about half a second and then went back to her stitching with the expression of someone whose expectations have been met on schedule. Gideon Rusk was formally charged in February. The state investigators had been thorough, which Eleanor had hoped for but not assumed. The charges covered 3 counties: land fraud, conspiracy to contaminate public water resources, and arson in connection with the Mercer barn fire. The arson charge came from one of Rusk's own men, a hired hand named Devers, who had been with the carriage at the auction and who, when faced with the prospect of sharing charges with a man who would clearly direct every possible consequence toward anyone useful to sacrifice, had made a practical decision and talked to the investigators. Devers described, in considerable detail, the night of the barn fire, the 2 men Rusk had sent, the materials they'd used, the specific order Rusk had given on the night of the first storm. He described other things too, from other properties, other ranches, other wells that had been helped along toward failure. The testimony was specific and detailed and corroborated enough of Eleanor's documents that it held up. Silas got a letter from Investigator Marsh on a Tuesday morning in February, short and factual, informing him of the charges and the upcoming proceedings. He read it at the kitchen table with Eleanor across from him and handed it to her when he was done. She read it, put it on the table, looked at him. He looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things don't need saying and trying to say them just gets in the way. "Gerald Sims," Silas said finally. "Is there a way to—" "I wrote to him 3 weeks ago," Eleanor said. "When I knew the investigation was serious. I told him what was happening, told him the state was building a case that covered what happened to him." Silas raised his eyebrows slightly. "What did he say?" She picked up the letter and found the page she was looking for. She'd gotten Gerald Sims's response 4 days ago and had been carrying it in her coat pocket, waiting for the right moment. She set it on the table facing Silas. The letter was short. Gerald Sims had never been a man of many words, based on what Eleanor knew of him. He'd written, "I heard from those Austin investigators last week. They used your documents. I want you to know I'm glad I gave them to you and not sorry I did. I was sorry for a long time. I'm not anymore." Silas read it, read it again, set it down carefully. "That's a good thing," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The spring came late and argumentatively, the way Texas springs sometimes do, cold and warm and cold again, the land deciding slowly whether it was going to cooperate. Eleanor watched the fields from the kitchen window in March, and thought about the particular stubbornness of things that refused to stay dead. The soil that had looked like pure dust last summer was showing the first narrow threads of green in the low areas where the snow had melted and settled. The cattle that remained were healthier. The well water had been tested twice since the mining site was officially closed by the state, and both tests had come back clean, the contamination level dropping as the channel was filled in and the drums removed. The creek ran cleaner. Not perfect yet, but moving in the direction of clean, which is what matters. Pete replanted the kitchen garden in April with a thoroughness that suggested he'd been wanting to do it for a while and had been waiting for the circumstances to justify it. He and Eleanor had reached the kind of working relationship that doesn't require much conversation, because the communication is mostly practical and the mutual respect is mostly silent, which suited them both. He told her once, in the direct way he had, "Ranch is different since you came." She'd said, "In what way?" And he'd said, "In all the ways," and gone back to what he was doing, which she'd understood was the highest form of compliment available in Pete's register. The barn was finished in late March. It had taken longer than the original crew of volunteers had hoped. Weather, materials, the ongoing complications of a working ranch where there was always something else also needing to be done. But it was finished and it was solid, and Silas walked through it on the morning it was completed with an expression Eleanor watched from the yard rather than the doorway, because some moments need to be private. He came back out and stood in the yard and looked at the structure for a while. She walked up and stood beside him. "Better than the old one," she said. "Different," he said. "Not better or worse. Different." She understood what he meant. The old barn had been built over 20 years, layer by layer, with specific things in specific places that meant something. The new one was starting from nothing, which was a different kind of thing. Not worse, just new. "That's not a bad thing," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." He looked at her with the expression that she'd watched develop over months into something specific to her, the particular way he looked at her that was different from the way he looked at anything else. Not romantic in a theatrical sense, just specific, just hers. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. I talked to the minister about a civil ceremony. He looked slightly pained saying this, in the way of a man who is more comfortable doing things than talking about doing things. Fletcher's wife mentioned a woman in the next county who does that sort of thing, a justice of the peace. Eleanor looked at him. Is that a question? I'm getting to the question. Take your time. He turned and faced her fully, which he'd learned to do when he was saying something he meant. I want you to stay, he said, not in the capacity you came here, as I want you to be here, properly, as part of this. He gestured at the barn, the yard, the house behind them, where Thomas and Clara were at their lessons. All of it, for as long as it matters to you, which I hope is a long time. It was not the most eloquent proposal in the history of proposals. Eleanor recognized that even as she stood in the yard hearing it, and she found that recognition genuinely warming rather than disappointing, because she was not a woman who needed eloquence from a man who had instead given her honesty for 7 months straight. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. Yes. Yes. She looked at him. Did you think I was going to say no? I thought there was a possibility, he said, with the specific dignity of a man trying to cover how much he'd been worrying about exactly that. Silas. Yeah. I went into a burning barn with you. He looked at her. I think that covered the question, she said. He laughed. It was not a polished laugh, not the practiced social laugh of a man who laughs at the right moments. It was the laugh of a man who had not laughed enough in the preceding year and was slightly surprised by the sound of himself doing it. It lasted only a moment and then settled into a smile that stayed. She'd seen him smile before, but this one was different, more complete, less managed, more his. Thomas and Clara were told that evening after dinner. Clara said, without looking up from the rabbit she'd been drawing, I know. Thomas said nothing for a moment, then looked at his father, then at Eleanor, with the careful accounting of a boy who understands that some decisions are already made, and what matters now is what comes after. Is your room going to change? He asked Eleanor. It'll probably change somewhat, she said. Who's going to be in the kitchen in the morning? I am, she said. Same as always. He nodded slowly. And you're not leaving? No. He picked up his fork and ate the last of his beans. Okay, he said. Clara looked up from her drawing. I'm going to call you Mama Ellie, she said, with the announcement quality of someone who has decided something that is not up for discussion. The table went quiet for a moment. Eleanor looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her with absolute serenity. If that's what you'd like, Eleanor said carefully. It is, Clara said, and went back to her rabbit. Silas, beside Eleanor, said nothing. But she felt the quality of his silence change again. That thing she'd gotten good at reading over the months. The way his quiet had different textures depending on what was inside it. This one was the good kind, the full kind. The civil ceremony was in May, in the yard of the ranch on a Saturday afternoon, simple enough that it barely deserved the word ceremony. Fletcher and his wife came. Pete stood beside Silas. Dr. Beaumont came because Eleanor had asked him, and he'd accepted with the quiet dignity of a man who understood what the invitation meant. Thomas sat on the porch railing and watched with his arms crossed and his expression serious, which was exactly how she'd expected him to watch. Clara had made herself a crown of the wildflowers that had finally, stubbornly, begun appearing in the fields, and wore it with the absolute conviction that it was appropriate to the occasion. The justice of the peace was a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Harriet Cole, who had been performing these ceremonies for 15 years, and had developed the efficient warmth of someone who had seen enough of them to know which parts mattered and which parts were just tradition for tradition's sake. She said what needed to be said. Silas said yes. Eleanor said yes. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Pete shook Silas's hand after, gripped it for a moment with both of his, the way men do when they want to say more than they're going to say. Fletcher kissed Eleanor on the cheek with the awkward gallantry of a man not entirely sure how to calibrate the gesture. Margaret Fletcher hugged her properly, which Eleanor accepted with more ease than she would have 7 months ago. Dr. Beaumont found her near the kitchen door while Silas was talking with Fletcher about the new fence line. How are you? He asked. Good, she said, and meant it. He looked at her with the evaluating attention she'd gotten used to from him. I've been in this county 22 years, he said. I've seen a lot of situations that needed fixing. Most of the time, the people who could fix them either didn't know it or didn't care to." He paused. "You knew it and you cared to. I want you to know that's not a common combination." She looked at the yard, at the people in it, at the barn standing where the burned one had been, at the children, Clara still in her wildflower crown, Thomas now off the porch railing and explaining something with great seriousness to Cal, who was nodding with the patient attention of a man who knew 9-year-olds needed to be heard. "I just did what needed doing," she said. "Most people say that," Beaumont said. "Almost nobody does it." He moved away to find his hat, and Eleanor stood at the kitchen door and let the afternoon happen around her. The rains came in June, which was later than anyone wanted, and earlier than most people had stopped hoping for. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard it start. That particular sound, the sound of actual rain hitting dry ground, which is different from any other sound in the world if you've been without it long enough. It starts almost tentative, like the sky isn't sure, and then it finds its confidence and comes down properly. She went to the front door and stood in the doorway. Thomas heard it and came down the stairs 2 at a time and pushed past her onto the porch, looking up at the sky with an expression of pure, uncomplicated relief that she had not seen on his face before. Clara came behind him, slower, stood in the doorway beside Eleanor, and looked out at the rain falling on the yard and the fields and the roof of the new barn and the fence line that Pete and the hands had been working on all spring. Silas came from the direction of the paddock, his hat dark with rain, moving without hurrying toward the house. He saw the 3 of them in the doorway and stopped for a moment, looking at them, and Eleanor saw the same thing on his face she'd seen after the ceremony, that specific quality of a man encountering something he'd stopped letting himself want and had slowly, carefully started wanting again. Clara said, in a very small voice, "It's raining." "It is," Eleanor said. "A lot." "Good." Clara thought about this. Then she stepped off the porch and walked out into the rain in her socks, which was emphatically the wrong choice, footwear-wise, and exactly the right choice by every other measure. She stood in the yard with her face up and her eyes closed and the rain coming down on her wildflower crown, which was surviving better than anyone might have expected. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Thomas. He sat on the porch railing and watched his sister with the long-suffering expression of a boy who will not admit how much he wants to do exactly what she's doing, and then he got off the railing and walked out into the rain without saying anything about it. Silas came up the porch steps and stood beside Eleanor in the doorway. He was wet and smelled like horses and rain and work. He looked out at his children standing in the yard in the first rain in months, and something in his face did the thing she'd watched it do over the course of all these months. Opened, slowly, like a hand that had been clenched and had finally decided it could stop. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They stood like that in the doorway, watching the rain come down on Caldwell, on the fields that would now maybe give something back, on the new barn and the repaired fences, and the clean creek running higher already at the far edge of the property. It is easy, looking at a moment like that, to decide you're seeing the end of a story. To say, here, this is where the hard part stopped and the good part started. But Eleanor had lived long enough to know that's not how it works. The hard part doesn't stop. It changes shape. Silas was still a difficult man, and she was still a woman who kept too much to herself, and Thomas was still 9 years old and complicated, and Clara was still going to ask questions that had no good answers. The ranch still had debt. There were still crops to get in and fences to maintain, and the legal proceedings against Rusk were still ongoing and would be for months. None of it was resolved in the clean way stories sometimes resolve. But there was this. 2 children running in the rain in their socks, laughing, the sound of it carrying back to the porch like something physical. And a man standing beside her who had put his arm around her without ceremony, which was how she preferred most things. And the particular feeling of being somewhere that had needed you and that you had needed back, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. Eleanor had spent a long time before Caldwell being useful, moving from place to place with her canvas bag and her flat envelope of documents, fixing things that needed fixing, staying long enough to make sure the fix held, and then moving on. It had been a life. Not a bad one, but it had been built for moving and not for staying, and she'd never entirely questioned that until she'd been in this house long enough to understand what staying could mean. What it meant, she thought, was this. The weight of continuity, the accumulation of small things over time, learning how someone takes their coffee, knowing which floorboards creak, understanding that a certain kind of quiet means one thing from one person and a completely different thing from another. Building a vocabulary of a life alongside someone else's life. It was slower than she was used to, less dramatic, and it required a kind of courage she hadn't needed in the same way before, not the courage to confront something, but the courage to stay when there was nothing to confront, when it was just ordinary days and ordinary difficulties, and the patient, ongoing work of being present. She was still learning how to do it. She suspected she would be for a long time. Thomas came back to the porch eventually, soaked, and stood dripping on the boards with the expression of a boy who has done something he's not going to apologize for. Eleanor handed him a towel from inside the door. He took it without a word and dried his face. "The East Field is going to flood if this keeps up," he said. "I know," Silas said. "Pete's going to have to clear the drainage ditch." "I know that too." "I could help with that," Thomas said, carefully, not quite asking. Silas looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "You could." Thomas dried his hair and watched the rain and leaned against the porch railing with his arms crossed in the posture Eleanor had always thought was his unconscious imitation of his father, and she looked at the two of them standing the same way in the same doorway and felt something she didn't try to name because names made things smaller than they were. Clara came back last, soaked through, crown still on her head, absolutely unrepentant. She came up the porch steps and stood in front of Eleanor and held out her arms to be wrapped in the towel. Eleanor already had waiting, and Eleanor wrapped her up, and Clara leaned into her chest the way she had in the cot during the storm, with the total unselfconscious trust of a child who has decided where safety lives. "Mama Ellie," Clara said into the towel. "Yes, the rain smells like the bread you make." Eleanor thought about this. "That's a very specific observation." "It does, though, sort of." "Sort of," Eleanor agreed. The rain came down on Mercer Ranch and on Caldwell and on the dry fields that needed it, and the creek that was running cleaner every week and the new barn standing where the burned one had been. It came down on all of it without distinction, the way rain does, not knowing or caring what it was washing over, just doing what it does. Inside the house, the stove was on. The windows held against the weather. The lamp was turned up in the kitchen, throwing light out through the glass into the wet afternoon. And at the table, if you had been inside to see it, there were enough plates set for everyone.